Alright folks, welcome to the second installment of Lost in Translation, the series where I explore iconic characters from the Walking Dead comics who were done dirty in the TV adaptation. In this installment, I of course will be focusing on Andrea, a character changed so drastically that referring to her as an adaptation feels generous. It would be an understatement to say Andrea's comic counterpart was a fan favorite, as she was a skilled sniper, protector of children, loyal ally, and tough as nails. Basically everything you'd want in a survivor. But throughout her run on the show, it became clear this was a wildly different take on the character, which for many fans, myself included, just didn't work. So today, I wanted to discuss why Andrea was so beloved in the comic, why she fell flat in the show, and what could have happened behind the scenes that led to such a drastic change. But with that, if you end up enjoying this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button and drop a sub to see more content like this. Now, to understand why I believe Andrea was lost in translation, you need to understand just how great a character she was in the comic. Officially introduced all the way back in issue 3, Andrea always stood out as one of the best written women in the early issues. If you're familiar with the early comic run, it's pretty apparent many of the female characters were often written in roles that revolved around romantic subplots or interpersonal conflicts. Even Michonne, who was introduced as a badass fighter, was often drawn into these sort of narratives during the prison arc, and later, deeply traumatic stories that felt intended for shock value rather than character development. He definitely improved in this aspect of his writing as the series continued to evolve, but from the get-go, very little unnecessary drama or out-of-pocket storylines surrounded Andrea's character. We meet her just as she loses her sister Amy, but rather than letting her grief define her, she channels it into developing skills to protect the group. While characters like Carol and Michonne were entangled in a romantic triangle with Tyrese, and Glenn and Maggie were constantly disappearing from the group to hook up, Andrea was posted up in the prison guard tower, honing in her skills as a sniper and looking out for those suffering in more ways than one. All while reeling from a recent, nearly fatal attack by notorious murderer Thomas Richards that she was luckily able to fend off, but left her physically scarred for life. This doesn't mean there wasn't any focus on her relationships, however, as rather early on, she and Dale get together and stay together as they legitimately fall in love, which may sound a bit weird to you TV-only viewers, but actually comes off as really sweet and admirable in the comic. There's no strings attached either. Andrea truly loves Dale, and that's that. No cheating, and mostly no drama, which was a huge breath of fresh air when compared to some of the other side plots going on in the prison. If anything, Dale was the drama starter, as he was extremely insecure about the age gap. Although, to be honest, this insecurity is what added complexity to their relationship. The love Andrea held for others didn't end there either, as come the deaths of a couple named Donna and Alan, the two would take in their twin sons Ben and Billy and raise them as their own. And as the series went on, these positive character traits only became ever the more prevalent as, by the prison massacre, she single-handedly repels the governor's initial surprise attack while taking a bullet skimming across the head, all in the name of protecting the people she loves. Even after being pressured by Dale to leave their allies in the face of another attack, Andrea persuades him to double back in order to help once again at the risk of her own safety. And over the next few chapters, she would continue to stand her ground in believing these were the people they were supposed to be with even when Dale's frustrations peaked. However, come the Fear the Hunters arc in Volume 11, Andrea would face her greatest challenge yet as she would lose her son Billy at the hands of his unstable brother Ben, before losing Ben to Carl as well covertly the next night, who believed he was the only one with the strength to do what had to be done. And without even getting a chance to grieve, Dale would be kidnapped and mutilated by the hunters before revealing he had been bit the night before. And just like that, Andrea lost everything she had gained in this horrific world. But once again, she didn't let this grief consume her. She may have been angry over what happened and participated in the slaughtering of the hunters, but she was still emotionally grounded and capable of pushing through the fog. And eventually, after accepting Dale's death and finding a home within Alexandria, Andrea and Rick would find comfort in each other and begin one of the longest lasting relationships in the series. And all throughout No Way Out, the Savior arc, and All Out War, her sniping skills and dedication to her friends would remain instrumental in their prosperity as she served as Rick's moral backbone through these hard times. "We don't die" was her motto, as no matter the circumstance, she would remain alive, as that's what they do for the sake of the people they loved, even coming out on top against an armed savior who got the jump on her and nearly ended her life. And following the arrest of Negan and the 2-year time jump, Andrea would settle into her position as Alexandria's co-leader along with her husband, who never actually proposed to her, before taking up arms once again come the Whisperer War. However, Andrea's dedication to helping others is what eventually led to her downfall, as while leading the Whisperer's mega horde to the coast, Eugene would nearly fall victim to the dead before getting rescued by Andrea, who unfortunately suffered a bite to the neck in the chaos. And what followed was possibly the saddest issue in the series, as every character we've come to know gets the chance to say goodbye. And even though she was the one suffering, she still looks out for Rick on her deathbed by demanding he keeps fighting through this world. "We don't die" was now a joke to her. But what she didn't realize was that thanks to everything she's done to get the Coalition where they were, her memory would stay alive through everything they do going forward. And as she took her last breath, Rick would be forced to put her down before facing the people of Alexandria, who were more than willing to pick him back up in the aftermath. Andrea's influence throughout the series would continue even after her death, as Rick would severely struggle with his grief, even sleeping on her grave on some of the harder nights. But in the end, she died a hero and left behind a legendary legacy, with Carl eventually naming his daughter after her in honor. However, what's kind of funny is that my personal favorite Andrea scene actually doesn't feature her in the flesh at all. It comes at the beginning of issue 169 after her death, as Carl kneels over her grave with Lydia by his side. He goes on to tell her the story of killing Ben, but here, he begins describing how when he finally told her years later he was the one that killed him after growing so close after the war, she began to cry a lot. But as she wiped the tears away, she looked Carl in the eye and told him she loved him. And from that moment forward, he began calling her mom, as a parent's love is unconditional. Without getting too much into my personal life, this interaction of being accepted by someone who isn't your actual parent hit extremely hard and solidified Andrea as one of my personal favorites in the entire series. And I'm sure I'm not the only one, as Kirkman felt the need to write an entire letter to the fanbase apologizing for her death, but also justifying his decision. Now, comparing comic Andrea to her TV adaptation. Well, let's just say it's a very different story. I'm sure most of you are thinking, everything I just described doesn't apply to the TV adaptation, which you would be correct about. But just to be clear, this is not a dig at Laurie Holden in any way. She's a great actress that truly did her best with what she was given. Now, from the jump, TV Andrea was defined by her grief and unpredictable nature more than anything. We first meet her in Season 1, Episode 2, as she raises a gun to Rick's head before even considering the consequences. Like in the comics, Andrea was close with her sister Amy, but after Amy's death, the TV version spirals into despair, as she convinces herself there is no hope left in this world, which is an understandable reaction, but it already sets her down a very different path. And going into Season 2, her growth would continue to feel disjointed, as she would have moments of strength like when she attempted to take up arms to defend the camp, all while simultaneously attempting to abandon the group along with Shane, which again was highlighted as something comic Andrea would not do, even when Dale pleaded with her. Although, I'll admit this seemed more like an internal struggle rather than sloppy writing. And speaking of Dale, instead of their passionate love story that defied the status quo, the two had a somewhat father-daughter-like relationship, with Dale at times coming off as clingy and overprotective, while Andrea often came off as harsh and bitter towards him before cutting that story short altogether come Dale's premature death. At times, it can be really hard to get a grasp of her moral compass as she experiences what the loss of a sibling feels like, only to downplay the severity of Beth's condition to Maggie, which comes across as insensitive and somewhat hypocritical, as she should know what death does to those left behind. And by the end of season 2, she's separated from the group during the invasion of the farm and is ushered into a completely different role than what we saw in the source material, which was actually the nail in the coffin for her character, as come season 3, she's at the forefront of the Governor arc where she falls in love with him and begins trusting his word over Michonne, who kept them both alive throughout the entire winter. The Governor was very clearly corrupt and hiding secrets that were visible if you were looking, but Andrea just couldn't see past the rose-tinted glasses, or at the very least, didn't want to for the majority of the season. Michonne's line, "You chose a warm bed over a friend," basically sums up her character perfectly this season, as that is truly what happened. She didn't trust Michonne's word or instinct, and for that, many people died by the Governor's hand, including herself, as by the time she comes around to seeing Philip's true horror, it was too late. He had sicked a walker onto her while restrained, resulting in a bite to the neck, which interestingly mirrors her comic counterpart's death despite the issue releasing years later. The show had tried to redeem her character in her final stretch of episodes by having her nearly assassinate the Governor while attempting to get back to her real friends, but by that point, the damage was already done for most fans. And with that, Andrea went out with a whimper. Outside of season 2, there were very few moments displaying her skills as a sharpshooter. She was very rarely loyal to her allies, as she attempted to abandon the group on numerous occasions before actually doing so with Michonne, who was her closest post-outbreak friend. And although she was close with Amy, Andrea's grief after her death closed her off emotionally. So unlike her comic counterpart, she never really regains that warmth or protectiveness towards children, or at least doesn't get the chance to. Without basically any of her comic counterpart's skills, personality traits, or story, it's really hard to say these are even the same characters at all. A lot of the differences could be excused if TV Andrea was interesting on her own, but the truth is, she just wasn't. Some parts of season 3 make her feel like more of a plot device to get the story going rather than her own character. So with all that, what the hell happened? Why were these changes so severe? Well, the answer to that is sort of complicated. You see, a large portion of the issues with her character came down to a change in showrunners. With Frank Darabont, a lot of these negative traits were still there. I'm not going to pretend she was perfect from the start and became bad in season 3, because that's just not true, as we've discussed. The difference, however, was the planned growth the character would experience that was mutilated and cut short. Andrea, without a doubt, was flawed in the beginning, but Frank Darabont has gone on to state this frustration with the character was intentional, as he had plans to eventually evolve her into her comic counterpart, even talking about embracing the passionate love story between her and Dale, just with a bit of a different approach that would show her grow as a person from this destroyed individual to a hero. Laurie Holden originally signed on for 8 seasons under Darabont's direction, and her death in season 3 was actually a last-minute decision to spice up the season 3 finale by Glenn Mazzara, the showrunner who replaced Darabont, which obviously came as devastating news as she was completely blindsided by the decision. Believing she would have a job for years to come, she was in the process of buying a house in Georgia only to be shafted early, which is a story we would hear again in the future. So it seems, behind the scenes, season 3 threw her so off course that she became expendable when she should have been vital to the series. Keep in mind, Andrea under Darabont's vision only had a handful of episodes to develop before his firing, and Frank is someone who likes to slowly tell his stories. So with this change of direction, she didn't even get the chance to get into those aspects of her character, which is such a shame. I can see how Andrea may come off as perfect in the comic from the jump. So in my mind, perhaps Darabont thought that type of character had to be earned over years of development, and her endpoint would maybe hit even harder if she was unlikable in the beginning. It's clear she was never going to be a one-to-one adaptation, but nobody really ever was. Dale was grouchy and pessimistic as hell in the comics, but in the show he was sort of the moral compass. So as it stands, I believe Andrea was lost in translation because the new showrunner didn't understand Darabont's original vision for the character, while only seeing the negative reception from fans, and failed to steer her back on course before prematurely ending that potential altogether. Under Frank's leadership, it's quite possible she could have evolved to be a fan favorite just like her comic counterpart, even with her less desirable traits in the beginning, such as wanting to abandon the group. But unfortunately, we live in a timeline where many mistakes were made along the way. Thankfully, however, the role Andrea plays in the comic was split between Sasha and Michonne in the show for the adaptation's later seasons. And although it was quite a bit different, I think some aspects, particularly the relationship between Michonne and Rick, works just as well, if not better. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Do you agree with most of the points I made here today, or do you think there's another reason as to why she was lost in translation? I'm excited to hear your thoughts in the comments down below, and let me know what other characters you would like to see featured in this series. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.